For more than 3 decades, Phil Mickelson was one of the safest names in golf. The smile, the impossible recovery shots, the dramatic finishes when victory seemed completely out of reach. Fans didn't just watch Phil because he won tournaments. They watched because he made golf feel unpredictable. Every risky decision created another unforgettable moment. But then, one decision changed the way the entire golf world viewed him. Because the same player who spent years representing the heart of traditional golf suddenly became one of the most controversial figures in the sport. The conversations around Phil were no longer only about majors, trophies, or incredible shots. They were about loyalty, money, competition, and the future direction of professional golf. And after months of questions, criticism, and speculation, fans wanted one thing. They wanted to hear Phil Mickelson explain his side of the story. Before the controversy, Phil's legacy seemed almost untouchable. He was the player who finally broke through at Augusta after years of disappointment. The player who battled Tiger Woods during one of golf's greatest eras. The player who became known as Lefty because of his unique style and fearless approach. For millions of fans, Phil was not just a golfer. He was a personality they felt connected to. His career was built on dramatic moments. Shots that seemed impossible. Decisions that made commentators question his strategy, and comebacks that reminded fans why they watched him every weekend. Even when Phil made mistakes, people continued following because they knew something special could happen at any moment. But every great career eventually reaches a turning point. For Phil Mickelson, that moment came when professional golf entered its biggest battle in decades. The arrival of LIV Golf changed everything. Players were offered enormous financial opportunities, and the traditional structure of the sport was suddenly challenged. The debate was no longer only about competition. It became a debate about the future identity of golf itself. And Phil became one of the central figures in that debate. For decades, Mickelson had been viewed as one of the faces of the PGA Tour. He represented the history, the rivalries, and the traditions that built modern professional golf to he became one of the biggest names to support LIV Golf. Many fans felt surprised. Some felt disappointed. Others believed he was simply making a business decision in a changing sports world. But the reaction was far more complicated than that. Because Phil's decision came with questions. Why leave the organization that helped build his career? Was it about money? Was it about changing the system? Or did he truly believe professional golf needed a different direction? Those questions followed him everywhere. And the longer Phil stayed quiet, the louder the speculation became. Every interview was analyzed. Every comment was debated. Every appearance created new discussions about what he really believed. For a player who had always been open with fans, the silence created even more curiosity. Then came another layer of controversy. Reports and public discussions surrounding Phil's gambling history added another challenge to his reputation. For years, rumors and questions followed him regarding his personal decisions away from the course. While some details became part of public record, others remained the subject of speculation and debate. And that created a difficult situation, because fans were no longer separating different chapters of Phil's career. They were connecting them. The LIV decision, the gambling discussions, the criticism from former supporters, the changing relationship between Phil and the PGA Tour. Suddenly, one of golf's most popular players had become one of its most debated figures. But the question remained the same. What did Phil Mickelson actually think about everything that happened? Because from his perspective, the story was very different. Phil argued that professional golf needed change. He believed players deserved more influence and better opportunities. He viewed the situation through the lens of competition, business, and the future of the sport. To his supporters, Phil was challenging a system that needed to evolve. To his critics, he was turning his back on the very organization that helped create his legacy. And that divide became impossible to ignore. The same player who once united golf fans was now creating some of the biggest arguments in the sport. That is what made Phil's eventual response so important. Fans were not only waiting for an explanation about LIV Golf. They wanted to understand his mindset. They wanted to know whether he regretted his decisions. They wanted to know if he believed history would eventually prove him right. Because legacy is not only built by what athletes accomplish. It is also shaped by how people remember their choices. And for Phil Mickelson, that became the biggest challenge of his career. The trophies were already there. The major championships were already won. The historic moments were already recorded. But the question of how future generations would view him remained unanswered. Would they remember the fearless competitor who transformed golf entertainment? Would they remember the six-time major champion who inspired millions? Or would the controversies of the later years become the defining part of his story? That was the battle Phil was facing, not on a golf course, but in the court of public opinion. And when Phil finally began addressing the questions surrounding his decisions, his words revealed a side of the story that many fans had never considered. Because behind the headlines, behind the criticism, and behind the controversy was a much bigger question. Did Phil Mickelson believe he was damaging golf? Or did he believe he was helping create its future? When Phil Mickelson finally addressed the growing criticism around his decisions, fans were not just listening to the words. They were searching for something deeper. They wanted to understand the mindset of a player who had spent decades building one of golf's greatest careers, and a player who went from being one of the sport's most beloved figures to one of its most controversial names. Because at that point, the debate was no longer about one decision. It was about legacy. Phil's explanation focused on a different perspective. He argued that professional golf was already changing before LIV golf entered the picture. The business side of the sport was becoming more powerful. Players were becoming more aware of their value. And the structure that had existed for decades was facing questions about whether it could continue in the modern sports world. To Phil, the conversation was not simply about choosing one side over another. It was about opportunity. He believed players deserved a stronger position in shaping the future of the game. He believed new competition could create pressure for improvement. And he believed professional golf had reached a point where change was unavoidable. But many fans saw the situation differently. They did not see a player trying to improve the sport. They saw one of golf's biggest stars leaving the organization that helped create his success. And that emotional reaction was impossible to ignore. Because sports are not only businesses. They are built on loyalty. Fans create connections with players over years and sometimes decades. They remember the victories. They remember the failures. They remember the moments that made them believe in a player. And when that player makes a decision that challenges those memories, the reaction becomes personal. That is exactly what happened with Phil Mickelson. For some fans, the LIV golf decision changed everything. They believed the money involved made the decision impossible to separate from financial motivation. They questioned whether tradition and history still mattered. They wondered whether the game they loved was moving in a direction they no longer recognized. But Phil's supporters saw another side. They believed he was willing to challenge a system that had become too comfortable. They argued that competition often forces organizations to improve. They pointed out that professional athletes have always had to make decisions about their careers and futures. And that created one of the biggest debates golf had ever seen. Who was actually protecting the future of the sport? The players who stayed with tradition? Or the players who pushed for change? That question still has no simple answer. Because professional golf is now caught between two realities. One reality values history. The legendary courses, the major championships, the traditions that have survived for generations. The other reality focuses on modern sports, global audiences, massive investments, new business models, and the constant pressure to attract younger fans. Phil Mickelson became the symbol of that conflict. His career represented everything traditional golf celebrated, but his decision represented everything that challenged it. That contradiction is what made his story so fascinating, because even his biggest critics could not deny what he accomplished. 6 major championships, one of the most successful careers in golf history, countless unforgettable moments, a style of play that inspired millions. Those achievements cannot simply disappear because of controversy, but controversy also cannot simply disappear because of achievements. And that is the difficult reality every legendary athlete eventually faces. How much should success protect a legacy? How much should mistakes change it? Those questions followed Phil as the years moved forward. His relationship with golf fans became more complicated. Some continued supporting him. Others felt disappointed. Some believed history would eventually view him as a visionary. Others believed the LIV chapter would always define his career. The answer may depend on what happens next, because history rarely judges athletes immediately. It takes time. Emotions change. New generations look back differently. The same decision that creates anger today may be viewed differently years later, or it may become the moment people remember forever. That uncertainty is what makes Phil Mickelson's legacy so interesting. He is not remembered as only a champion. He is remembered as a player who challenged expectations, a player who took risks, a player who was willing to create uncomfortable conversations. And whether people agree with those choices or not, one thing is undeniable. Phil changed professional golf. His decision forced the sport to confront questions it had avoided for years. Questions about money, questions about player power, questions about competition, questions about the future direction of the game. And perhaps that is the biggest impact of his controversial chapter. It forced everyone involved to think about what professional golf should become. Because without pressure, organizations rarely change. Without competition, systems rarely evolve. And without difficult conversations, sports often remain stuck in the past. The debate around Phil Mickelson will likely continue for years. Some will remember the golfer who thrilled crowds with impossible shots. Some will remember the champion who finally conquered Augusta. Some will remember the player who became the face of golf's biggest division. But perhaps the most accurate description is more complicated. Phil Mickelson was all of those things: a champion, a risk-taker, a fan favorite, a controversial figure, a player whose choices changed the direction of an entire sport. And that is why his story remains one of the most fascinating chapters in modern golf. Because championships create legends, but decisions define them. So now the question goes to you. Do you believe Phil Mickelson will eventually be remembered as a visionary who helped push golf into a new era? Or will the LIV golf controversy remain the moment that defines his legacy forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed documentary-style golf stories covering the biggest players, decisions, and controversies shaping the future of the game, subscribe for more deep breakdowns.